From The Australian, here's what's on the front. I'm Claire Harvey. It's Tuesday, December 3. The government says it will crack down on sexual violence in the military and change the rules for officers' promotion, all part of a bid to stop defence personnel self-harming and taking their own lives. That story's live right now at theaustralian.com.au. Just when you thought you had your head around the Middle East, now there's fresh conflict in Syria. Dictator Bashar al-Assad is on a mission to reclaim the city of Aleppo from rebels who seized it in a surprise raid over the weekend. Assad is backed by Iran, Russia and Hezbollah, but they're all a little busy right now. Today, our chief international correspondent Cameron Stewart joins me to sort out who's who and what they're fighting for. It was a stunning and unexpectedly successful assault. The relative stability brought about by decades of dictator rule destroyed in a matter of days. In Aleppo's town squares, rebels fired guns into the sky. Music blared from vehicles as they skidded across concrete, and monuments to Syrian President Bashar al-Assad were toppled. For days, the attack went unanswered by Syria's military. Its allies in Russia and Iran finally sent reinforcements for the regime to Hama in the nation's northwest. The rebels storming into Aleppo on the back of Toyota Hiluxes are an Islamist militia called Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS. Cameron Stewart is The Australian's chief international correspondent.
When the Syrian civil war pretty much ended in about 2018, they had a bastion up in the northwest of the country, and they've had their own little community, basically, that they've run without being harassed by the Syrian government. And what they did was they took this opportunity. They thought it was a great time to give a go at knocking off Bashar al-Assad, of course, the Syrian dictator. They've been waiting to do this for a long time. And so what they did was they charged into Aleppo, the huge northern city up there, and they went through it in 72 hours. And I think they even shocked themselves how quickly they took the city. And all of a sudden, you have a civil war which has been reignited.
Syria's civil war began in 2011, growing out of the so-called Arab Spring uprisings, where mass protests across the Middle East began calling for democratic reform. In Syria, the protesters were demanding an end to the regime of dictator Bashar al-Assad, a former ophthalmologist and soldier who's been in power since 2000 when he took over from his father, Hafez al-Assad. Russia swept in on the side of Bashar al-Assad, helping him launch a ruthless crackdown as the rebellion ballooned into a full-blown war. From 2015, Russian airstrikes killed tens of thousands of Syrians and shifted the war in Assad's favour. But now Russia's busy handling its own brutal war in Ukraine.
So the situation has come about because of two seismic events in the world. One was the October 7 Hamas massacre of Israelis, and also Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So what that's done is it's knocked out the three main allies of Assad, the three allies who helped him win that civil war from 2011 to 2018. And they were Hezbollah in Lebanon, and also Iran, and also Russia. And each of those allies is now involved fighting against democracies, very much weakened, very much distracted, and very much not in the mood to be sending an awful lot of military assistance, as they did last time, to Assad. So suddenly, he now finds himself much more alone than he ever was, with this rebel group advancing very quickly towards him.
Let's talk about that trio, Cam, Iran, Hezbollah and Russia. Hezbollah is essentially a puppet of Iran. It's the way Iran flexes its muscle in Lebanon and therefore inflicts pain on Israel on Iran's behalf. But what's Russia's role in this game?
Russia, it considers Syria its most valuable ally in the region. And in 2015, Russia effectively turned around the civil war in Assad's favour by providing troops and air support. And you might recall very, very vigorous and quite brutal Russian bombing of Syrian cities. And that really did turn the war in Assad's favour. In fact, frankly, it saved him as a president. So he's been very grateful to Russia ever since. Now, Russia is still his biggest supporter. It still has warplanes in the country. And in fact, we've actually seen some of these planes being deployed to bomb Aleppo in the last few days because after the rebels took it over. But the thing is, the Russians took a lot of the military support they had in Syria out of Syria and brought it back to Russia to be deployed against Ukraine in the war against Ukraine. And so there are far fewer Russian forces now in Syria than there were before. And it really is an open question as to how much use they are going to be. Certainly there'll be much less use to Assad than they were last time.
And what's in it for Vladimir Putin to be propping up Bashar al-Assad?
He wants to be, a geostrategic player. He wants to have influence around all of Russia's region. And with Syria, he has a base there that he can propagate Moscow's interests, political, strategic, economic, from that base. And he worries that if he loses Assad, then Russia loses its influence in the Middle East.
The rebel army that's taken Aleppo back has connections to Turkey. What do we know about that relationship?
Yes, it's a very shady relationship, if you like. This group, HTS, which is what the rebel group is, it's an offshoot of the Nusra Front, which in fact was allied to al-Qaeda at one point, although they are distancing themselves very much from that. They say they're a much more moderate group, but they're still listed as a terror group by the United States. And they are being backed by Turkey, but we don't quite know to what extent they're being backed by Turkey. Turkey does not like Assad. It wants Assad out. But how much it actually likes this group is very unclear too, because you have an Islamist group that is labelled as a terror organisation fighting Assad, who of course is backed, by Russia, Iran and Hezbollah, and of course is no friend of the West either.
Coming up, the rebel militia was formerly linked to al-Qaeda. So, is it going to be kinder to civilians than Bashar al-Assad? That's after the break. Presumably the enemies of Bashar al-Assad, for example, the United States and perhaps Israel, would be glad that there's a distraction going on for him now, that Syria is now riven again by civil war and that he'll have to turn his focus on defeating this insurgency in Aleppo. But what does it mean for the rest of the region, Cam, if anything?
Yeah, look, it certainly destabilises the region, Claire. It's amazing how it's been like this ever since October 7. It has spread like a bushfire, fairly slowly, obviously, into Gaza. We've had the war in Gaza. Then we had it spread into Lebanon. We've had the Houthis in Yemen attacking and being bombed. We've had Iranian-backed militia in Syria and in Iraq attack Israel. I mean, the region is very slowly going up in flames, and it's getting larger and larger with every passing month. And so to have the possibility of another civil war in Syria is hugely destabilising for the entire region. And we don't know yet, of course, where this offensive will go. I think the rebels have surprised themselves by going so quickly so far. And so it's going to be interesting to see whether they want to keep pushing on towards Damascus to really threaten Assad's actual existence. And of course, it's unclear to what degree the allies of Assad will come to his aid, because, as we said, they are so weakened compared to what they once were. So will Assad actually mount a major offensive to try and retake Aleppo, or is he not strong enough? And they're the questions I think in the next 3 or 4 days we're going to see answered.
Ordinary Syrians have suffered terribly under Bashar al-Assad. He's a brutal dictator. His regime has been accused of shocking crimes of terror against his own people. But is there any suggestion that life would be better for them under the rebel army?
People are actually fleeing the government-controlled areas of Syria and going up to the rebel-held areas. That includes in the northwest, which is controlled by the HTS, and in the northeast of Syria, which is controlled by the Kurds. And the reason why they're doing that is because the basics of life up there are seen to be better than they are in the government-controlled areas, and that means very simple things like electricity and water supplies, etc. They're much better organised than they are in the government-controlled areas. And I think that flight speaks a lot to the fact that Assad is very much on the nose, and that's partly because he promised at the end of the civil war to improve the economy. It really didn't happen. The economic conditions across the government-controlled areas are very, very grim, and people have been cheering the rebels as they came into to Aleppo and moved further south. Locals have been going out and cheering them, so I think that says a lot about how Assad is on the nose.
You mentioned the Kurds. That's an ethnic group that's been fighting for their own homeland for many, many generations now. They're managing to run what seems like a fairly functional state in the northeast of Syria. Who's backing the Kurds now, and what role do they play in relation to the al-Assad regime?
Well, they've basically got the northeast of Syria now. That was sort of after the civil war. They just occupied that. The government troops could not come back and retake it. So it's almost like an autonomous region for them at the moment, Claire, even though it's very unofficial. The US, though, has backed the Kurds. And in fact, there's US troops stationed in eastern Syria. There's several hundred of them there. Now, there's no suggestion that the US is going to suddenly back the Kurds to move against Assad, but they are a big player in this whole equation, and they're sitting there and they don't want Assad in power either. So there's lots of opposition groups who have different ideologies up in northern Syria that want Assad out of power, but they don't necessarily agree with each other.
Cameron Stewart is the Australian's chief international correspondent. The family court has granted cross-sex hormone treatment to a gender dysphoric 15-year-old born a boy but who has identified as a girl since the age of 3. It's a complex case, and the judge says there's a lack of legal material about whether kids who transition end up with regret. That's an exclusive, live now at theaustralian.com.au.